Hello everyone, this is Chris from Locofy here, and today I will be showing you how you can build a fully functional events page similar to Eventbrite, and we will only be using low-code tools for this. So in order to build the front end, we will be using Locofy, and then in order to have a fully functional database and a backend, we will be using Hygraph as a headless CMS. And what you will end up with is a pixel-perfect, fully responsive, and fully functional web app within less than 1 hour. So before we get started, I just want to give you guys a quick overview of what Locofy is. So Locofy is basically a low-code dev tool for everything related to front end, and it enables you to ship your final product 5 to 10 times faster than using your existing coding approach, right? So what's really important to us is that, yes, we want you to build fully functional apps. It should be a full stack app. It should be much faster, right? We are proposing an entirely new process here. But what's also really important to us is that you can keep using your existing design tools such as Figma and Adobe XD. You can keep using your existing tech stacks like React, React Native, regular vanilla HTML, and also just your existing workflows. And this can work whether you are the only person, you're doing your own designs, you're doing front end and back end, or if you work in a bigger team where you have separate designers, where you have front end developers, back end developers, Locofy will perfectly integrate into all of those workflows. So let's get started.
For this project, I picked a template from the Figma community designed by Avi Jansa. It's just a simple events website here, and we can make our adjustments to use this for our purposes. So what I've done, okay, let me just jump over into Figma here. What I've done here is I've removed some of the elements. I've made some small adjustments to the text and to the layout and the design to fit our project a bit better. But one thing that's important is that while we're here working in Figma, so far I've not yet worked with Locofy at all. So all of my process of designing this and of making the adjustments are exactly the same way that you currently would when you work in Figma, or the way that your designer in your company does. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that you can use all of your existing workflows and also your existing tools. So you can also do this in Figma, you can do this in Adobe XD. Yeah, let me just give you a quick overview of the website that we have here. So basically we have a hero section at the top with some static text. We have a search bar down here where you can pick from a certain location. And then you have the component of the upcoming events that are here. So this is what we will be dynamically populating later on from the database. And then we just have a footer down here. Okay, so let's get started working on this design file. So just to give you a bit of an overview of how working with Locofy works is that you would usually have your design file, like let's say like a Figma file or something like this. Then you work with the Locofy plugin to prepare the design a bit, and from there you can then export your design into the Locofy builder in order to make some basic setup for the project, like for example the language that you want to use, and also if you want to have any sort of reusable components, you can set it up as well in the Locofy builder. Don't worry, I will be covering that later, how the Locofy builder works. And after that, you would then be syncing your code either to GitHub or to something like Visual Studio Code. But we will get into all of that later. That was just a quick overview over how the process works. So let me first get started with this here. So in order to do the basic setup for this design, I can install the Locofy plugin in Figma here. So I just go up here to resources, I go to plugins, and I search for Locofy, and then I just run this plugin. So this is already set up here now, but obviously when you do it the first time, it would look different. So let me just click over here and I will create a new project, and let's call this project Loco Events 3. And then we can choose a framework here. So also in this case, we wanted to build a web app. So I will choose React. I will go with JavaScript in this case, and I will like to use Tailwind. So you can see there's all kinds of different options that you can have. You can work with TypeScript. You can work with CSS modules or inline styles instead. But in this case, let's go with the JavaScript and the Tailwind. And let's create this project. Okay, perfect. So as you can see here, when you're in the Locofy plugin, there are 3 different steps that you need to perform in order to get your design ready to be exported into code. Not to worry, we will go through all of those steps in detail, but just a basic overview. We have step 1, which is the design optimizer. That is relevant because even though your workflow in Figma stays the same, there are some best practices that you should have in order to create really high quality code. And that's what we're trying to achieve here, right? We're not just trying to build a simple landing page or something like that, where it doesn't matter if the code is good or not. We are trying to build real code quality that other developers can then work with as well. And like you can export that code and then do an integration with an API. So that's why you need something like the Design Optimiser to help you adjust your Figma file just a bit, because we don't want you to have to learn all of this by yourself. Then secondly, you can tag all of your layers, basically, which makes your elements interactive. And lastly, you can also use pre-existing UI library elements. But all of this we will get into much more detail later on. So before we get started with step number 1, the Design Optimiser, let's just select this web page that we have here and preview this in the plugin. So this is actually a fully functioning browser preview. This is already the code that would be generated later on by Locofy. And this gives you a bit of an idea of the kind of things that you might want to fix still. So as you can see here, this is looking pretty good so far, I will have to say. I mean, we have real text here. We have all of the elements lined out correctly. I mean, this looks like a pretty decent landing page already. I do want to point out some things though, like even though Locofy has already fully converted all of this, you will notice some details. For example, when you click into this text field over here, nothing happens. This is text, not a text field. And also when you click on the buttons, like the search buttons or the links, there's nothing that happens, because so far Locofy would just assume that all of this is just text. Obviously, it doesn't know that we want this to be an input field or that we want this to be a button, right? And the second thing that we also notice is that when we adjust the size of the screen, it just stays at a fixed width, which again also makes sense. After all, we have designed a Figma file, and in Figma you usually use absolute positioning, so not a big surprise. But not to worry, we'll fix all of this in the next few minutes. So let's just jump right into the step 1. So let me just close the preview here, and I will go into step 1, which is the Design Optimiser. So as I've mentioned, there is some small changes, some small things that are a bit different when working with Figma and Locofy. It's mostly about applying auto layout correctly, the way that you group your elements. For example, oftentimes when we design a button, maybe we would put like a rectangle in the background and then put a text element in front. But obviously, if we then copy this over into code, this generates 2 elements, like a div probably and a text element, and that's unnecessary code because we can just give a background color to the element. So all of those are just the small habits that change a bit when you want to work with Locofy, but not to worry, the Design Optimiser will automatically suggest how to fix all of those things. Okay, so let's see what are all of the fixes that are suggested by the Design Optimiser. So basically, there are a few different steps that the Design Optimiser will take. So first, we will take a look at the design structure of your Figma file, and it will automatically suggest the kind of things that you can fix here. So for example, there's one option that, like, ideally to generate really high quality code from a Figma file using Locofy, you should convert all the groups into frames. Like I mentioned, you don't need to remember this. The Design Optimiser just takes care of this for you automatically. So you can just click on fix here and it automatically fixes this for you. And the interesting thing is that this will actually update in the Figma file itself. So it's not just in the Locofy tool, it will actually apply in Figma directly itself, right? So then you have a few other options as well, like for example, automatically applying auto layout to certain elements in your design. So let's just fix this here as well. And then the last part is that obviously we also want to handle the responsiveness of the web page, right? So luckily Figma already has auto layout inbuilt, right? So I mean, if your designers work with auto layout in Figma, you will have very few things that you will need to fix later on. But in this case, for example, I've not really used a lot of auto layout to go through the Design Optimiser, and we can just see the fixed options here, right? So what we see is, let's say we have the hero section here, for example, right? Let's just view the fixed options, what we have. And what you can see is that the Design Optimiser actually automatically suggests what to do with this in order to make it work better with Locofy, right? So in this case, for example, I suggest to automatically apply Figma's own fill container property to all the child elements. And if I select this, I will get a live preview of what this looks like. I can also see like what happens if I wouldn't apply this, and then we can see that we get exactly what we had earlier, which is that it's just like a static page basically, which doesn't adjust. But then when we apply this property, then it will nicely adjust dynamically to the width. So let's just confirm this fix. And then as you can see here, there's obviously like lots of other fixes as well. I will go through all of them by myself, but I will just speed up this section. You don't have to watch me do all of those things. Okay, nice. So now I'm done with all of the fixes that I've checked. Do keep note that you don't have to accept all of the fixes. Sometimes it also makes sense to actually keep the design as it is. It depends a bit on the kind of outcome that you want. So that's why you have that live preview to decide whether you want to accept the fix or not. So let's go back to the plugin and let's go to the next step, which is the tagging part, right? So wait, actually first, before we go into the tagging part, let me give a quick preview of what the design looks like now. So what you can see, let me give a bit more space here, okay? So what you can see here is that now we have the design nicely adjusting to the width of the screen. Let's say, for example, down here, we see that the search bar actually adjusts to the width of the screen that we have. So let me just close this preview here. And then we can go to the next step, which is tagging. So tagging is important. As I mentioned earlier, currently some elements like, for example, this input field here or this button here, they're not yet interactive because obviously Locofy doesn't know that we want this to be interactive. So what we do is that we just select this element here. So this one, for example, we want it to be an input element, right? So let me just select the text here. And then I go over here onto the step 2, and then I can select from a list of elements that are available, right? So in this case, for example, I would want this to be an input, and then I can choose some additional options of how I want to set this up, right? So for example, what you can do is that you can use some sort of existing UI library like Material UI or Bootstrap in order to get that same kind of styling that you have from there, and it's fully set up. In this case, I don't want to use a library. And then you can set up all kinds of other properties as well, right? So for example, you can choose the type of the input field. You can have a placeholder text. You can say that, okay, in this case, for example, we definitely want this field to be a required field, and maybe even autofocus makes sense, right? Because we want the user to search straight away, right? So yeah, this is what we can set up here, right? So, and now we are done. So one interesting thing that you notice is that now that I've clicked this, Locofy actually automatically detects elements that are very similar and probably also have the same tag. So what I can do is I can review them. And then in this case, for example, it correctly has identified that this area over here is also an input because it's a duplicate of the element, right? And then what I can do is I can just accept this here, set it up in the same way. So I don't want a UI library for this. And yes, I do want this to be a required field. And then we are done. Let me just export this here. Okay, perfect. So now the next thing that we do is that we go over here to the button, we select the button, and obviously we want this to be interactive as well. So what I do is after selecting the button, I can again go to step 2 here and then select button. Again, I don't want to have a UI library in this case. I think all of those attributes are okay. What you will notice is that there are 2 other tabs as well. So if I go into the styling and layout tab, for example, I have all kinds of options to adjust the CSS, like from flex or any sort of color effects, all the way to setting any advanced CSS property that you want, but it's really just a free text field to set any CSS property. And you can also set up some responsiveness over here as well. And then lastly, obviously, because we want this to be a search button, we want an action to happen. So let me go into this actions tab, and you can see there's all kinds of options here, right? You can change to a different page or open a pop-up or whatever else. But in this case, since this will later on trigger an API integration, we can just write a comment here. So let's just say integrate search API here at some point. Okay, perfect. Then we click done. And now when we open up this in the preview again, so let me just select the frame here so that it opens in the preview. And then I go down, and then now you can see that I can actually search, for example, in here. Let's say, for example, for rock concerts in Singapore. And then when I click, obviously, I mean, now it has become a button, but there's no action yet so far. So there's one third option that we can also do, right? Which is that, or third step actually, which is when you look down here at the drag and drop components, we can use pre-existing components from UI libraries. So let's say, for example, if for the location part, I don't want it to be a free text field, but perhaps I want it to be a drop-down field. So what I can just do is I can go to the third step down here. Then maybe let's make this, I think it would make sense to make this a select field, and maybe I would like to use Chakra UI. And then I just drag this into here, right? And you can see that there's actually a live preview of what this looks like, right? So then we just make some small adjustments. I just want this to be fill container, and then I can actually delete this old one here, right? I can delete this line as well. Don't need this anymore. And then what I can do is I can select this again, and then I can select some previews, right? So for example, I can set up the placeholder text that I want. So for example, in this case, I would maybe want it to be city, right, location. And I can add some options in here. So maybe let's have Singapore, New York, Delhi. And then we can have some other options in here as well. So maybe I want the text color to be white, for example, right? So let's set this up here, and the size to be, let's put it large. Yeah, and then we do have a live preview in here as well, where we can see how it would look like, and then we can press done, and then we have set this up. So let's take a look at what this would look like in the preview. And now when you see, you can type a text here, for example, like this, and then you can select from a drop-down menu here. Okay, so now one last thing that we want to do is to make a small adjustment here to the search bar. So what is happening right now, right, is that, okay, let me just make this small here, is that when you see this, the search bar nicely adjusts to the width of the screen. But obviously, if someone has like an ultra wide screen like this, for example, right, it will look really ridiculous to have like a area so wide, right? So what we can do is, okay, we can just close the preview here, and then we select the search bar here. And then what we can do is that basically we go into this tag, we added this here, we go into the styling and layout tab, and then what we can do is we can set up all the CSS properties that we would usually also have. So for example, in this case, maybe I want it to be such that it adjusts to the width automatically, but then I wanted to have a max width of 1086 pixels, like this basically, right? So then we can click done. And then when we load this again, so now we can go back to the main part, select this, preview it here. Let me make it a bit smaller. And what we can see here is that, yes, it will still nicely adjust to the size, but not beyond a certain width at which it will just stay at its max width. So now we have set up all the responsiveness and all the functionality in Locofy. So let me just close this again here. Okay, so now we have done all of the basic setup that we need to do in the Locofy plugin. So now we are ready for the next step. So remember how I mentioned that there is several steps to working with Locofy. Basically, you follow your regular design process in Figma or in Adobe XD, and then you use the Locofy plugin to do some basic setup like the tagging and the design optimizer like what we've seen just now. And now we are ready to actually take this project and export the code into the Locofy builder. And in the Locofy builder, we do all the more advanced setups such as components, and we have a live preview. We can share the prototype already, and we can also do lots of other things that we need to do to get our code ready. So let's get started with this. So now that we have everything, let me just select the frame here, and then I will click on view code here. So in this case, I would only like to have the selected frame. So let's call this view code in builder. And then it will just take a short while to generate all of the code. And now we can open this in the Locofy builder. So this will open a new tab in the browser. Right, so the Locofy builder is basically an intermediate step that we take between the Locofy plugin and the finished product to help us really generate some quality code and to hit the ground running when we move into development. So let me give you a quick overview of how the Locofy builder works. So what you can see here is that there are several different components, right? You can see a live preview, you can see some code going on here, but let me walk you through it from left to right. So what you can see here is you have your panel on the left side. So you have your file explorer where you can see all of the code that was generated by Locofy, and you can already get a bit of a sense of the file structure. Obviously, we will take a much deeper look into this later, but you can see the components that are being generated here and like the way that your app is basically set up. And then you can go into this layer panel over here, and here you see a live preview of what was generated. So this is already with the real code that we have. You can also see this on like different screen sizes, so you can have a responsive view of this. And then what you can also do is that you can click on this button here, view prototype, which gives you a live preview of what you have just built in the browser itself. And if you want to work with others together, you can also go on here, share prototype, copy the public link, and then send this to other people. For now, we won't do this. So let me just go back here, edit in builder. Lastly, we have an option here to export and deploy the code. So you have several options for both exporting and deploying the code. You can, for example, just download your project as a zip file. You can deploy this project directly from Locofy itself in just one click using platforms like Netlify and Vercel, or you can also sync a GitHub repository to your project, but more on that later. Next, we're going to set up some of the components in this project. So as I already mentioned earlier, actually Locofy recognizes automatically when there are certain elements in your project that can be used as components. And you can just go onto here, auto components of Locofy.ai, click here. And you can see all of the different ones that are being suggested to you. So I think those are quite
good suggestions actually. So let's take this for example, right? This is the local events footer. I mean, in this case, I think we can just call it footer, and then I will accept this suggestion. Okay, for the event container, I will get back to that later. I want to set this up manually, so I will skip this for now. I think this also makes a lot of sense. I mean, this one here is the hero section, so let's just do this. Same goes for the search form. And then, okay, maybe the events container, I would rather just have it as a div, so no need for that. And yes, let's reject this as well. Okay, perfect. So there are no other recommendations now. So now what we can do is we can manually set up this component here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this box here, the outer box. And next on the right side here, I'm going to click on Make Component. So you can see that actually Locofy automatically takes the name that we have given this in Figma, which is event box, which that works for me. So let's just click Create here. And then I can also add some props inside. So let's say, for example, I obviously have some things here that I want to customize, say, for example, the image, the title, all of that. So I can set it up here as well. So let's just go ahead and do this. So Locofy again automatically suggests certain things that you can adjust. So in this case, for example, it's top image. Yeah, so let's call this maybe not top image, but event image. And then for the value, we can select something here. So it can be, for example, from an asset that we already have in a project. Let's just select the correct one. Okay, save. And then I will do the same thing for the other props as well that we have in this component. So let me just add some more props here. We have this for this month. Yeah, this works. Okay, perfect. And now we are done with this component. So as you can see here, we actually have multiple instances of this component in this project. So obviously we don't want to delete them or like set them up multiple times to create redundant code. So what I can just do is I can select this instance here. Let me just go in here, click component again, make component. And instead of creating another component here, I can choose existing component. So I just see this event box here, right? I click select. Okay, perfect. This is all set up with all of my props and everything inside. So let's do the same thing here. Select this one, make component, choose existing, select. Okay, and that's all perfectly set up. Okay, perfect. Now we are ready to actually export our code. So, I mean, I could just go up here and export the project as a zip file, but obviously I want to like keep going back and forth. I want to maybe make some more changes in the builder here, in this page here, or maybe I want to update something in the Figma file and then I update something in my Visual Studio Code, and obviously I want all of those changes to be synced across. So the best option here is to actually push to GitHub and to have all of my changes synced all the time. By the way, just as a little FYI, there is also an option to directly deploy from Locofy itself as well. So I could just go, for example, to deploy with Netlify, then I just add my Netlify token here and I can literally deploy it in just one click. So it's super, super easy. But not today. So today we will just connect to GitHub. Okay, so just open this here. You can do this several ways. You can connect your GitHub account, or you can just use a GitHub token here, for example. So just click here. There's instructions. There's even a link inside here. So I'm just clicking on here. Then I'm already logged into my GitHub. Then, okay, let's call this local events 1 expiration. Okay, I mean, you can set the expiration date to any date that you feel is okay. Then you click on repo, and then you generate the token. Then you can copy this over here, add this, and then connect account. So in this case, I will create a new repository. Let's call this local events. Then confirm repo and branch. So obviously this is my first commit, so there won't be anything else here. And then I can just click to push to GitHub. So the first time will just take a short while to push everything over to GitHub. Okay, perfect. Now this project has been pushed to GitHub. We can go directly to the repository from Locofy. Let me just close this here. And then obviously we can just go over here and, for example, clone into this repo. So let me just copy this here. Then I will go into my Finder here, and then I just create a new folder here. And then let me just open up my terminal. CD, then go into this folder. Okay, perfect. Then I'll just copy into this GitHub, clone into this GitHub repo. Okay, perfect. So now you can see that all of my files are here, and then now I can just go ahead and open this in Visual Studio Code.
Okay, so now that we have cloned into our GitHub repo, we can just take a quick look at all of the code that has been generated for us. So you can see here we have our source folder with our pages inside, our app.js file, the page that we had created earlier, which we called local events homepage in Figma, and then also all of the components. So remember, we had some components that were automatically created, like our footer component, or our search bar basically. And then there was one component that we had also manually set up, which is our event box here. And you can see all of this code that is created is very high quality. You can see the properties in here and everything is set up nicely. And now in order to get started with this project, you can just check this readme.md file. And you just open up your terminal here. Then we just type npm install to install all of the libraries. Okay, now that all of the libraries have installed, we can just run npm start. And then now we can see our website here in the browser. So fully responsive. Okay, perfect. Now that we have exported our code and cloned into our GitHub repo, we can get started with setting up our backend using Hygraph. So Hygraph is a headless CMS that uses GraphQL. So what we will do is that we will set up our model in here and we will create some content in here as well. And then later on, we will go back into our code and connect to our Hygraph and make some queries there. Okay, so first we can create a new project here. You can see that Hygraph actually also offers you the option to use some schema templates ready-made, which will make it much easier for you to set up your schema, set up your database. But in this case, we will want to set up a custom project. So let's add a new project here. Let's call this Loco Events. And we select a region like, let's say, maybe India. I mean, obviously, you should select the region that's closest to you, which for me is India. So we will add this inside. This will just take a while. Okay, perfect. So now we have set up our new project here in Hygraph. And what we will do in order to get started is we will go over here into the schema tab and we will create a new model here. So we will call this model event. And what you see is that actually Hygraph automatically for us creates an API ID as well as a plural API ID. So you see here that it automatically names this event and events respectively. So we can add this model inside here. Okay, perfect. And now we can get started with setting up the fields that we have inside. So firstly, obviously we have an event name. So let me just add this here, a single line of text. This will be called, let's just call this name, not event name. We don't need to have that full title. Okay, and you see there's a few options here. So I think we don't need a description. I think we're pretty clear on what we're doing here. You see that they also have some other options like validations. You can set this as a required field or it has to be a unique field. You can even include some regex inside here in case you want to do a bit more complex validation for this field, but all of this will not be necessary in this case. So we'll just add this single line text field called name, and this will be holding the event name. Next, we want a multi-line text for the description. So we will call this description, and this is where we will store the description of the event inside. So let's add this inside here. Then next, we want to also have a date and a time for this event. So let's select this here, date time, and then we call this date time. Add this inside here. Okay, I guess we cannot have this. Let's call this event date time, my bad. And let's update this here as well, event date time. Let's add this here. And then lastly, we want to have an image for this event inside. So what we can do is we can choose this here, an asset picker, and we call this image. So you can see here that there's an option to allow multiple assets, but in this case, we just want to have one single header image for our events. So we won't be selecting this for now. Okay, perfect. So now that we have set up our schema for the database, we can hop on right into our content section here and start populating this database. So I will just be adding a few entries inside here so that it looks like we have a few events and so that it looks a bit more lively and realistic. So let me just go here to add entry. Then let's call this first event maybe something like coding 101. Then I asked ChatGPT to create a few short descriptions for me so that it looks a bit more lively. Okay, and then let's select the date. Maybe this could be like next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Okay, and then we can add an image inside here as well. Just upload the image, and then I've already prepared some images, so I think this one will go nicely for a developer event. Upload this. Okay, just one will be fine. Okay, perfect. And then now we can click save and publish for this event. We select that this image should also be published once it's ready, save and publish. And then we go back here and we click publish again, publish. Okay, and if we now go back to our content, then you can see that we have a published content with our event. So I'll just be adding 2 more entries here as well, just to make it a bit more populated. So let's call this salsa. I'll just be speeding up this part of the video. Okay, perfect. So now we have created all of those entries. We can head on over to the API playground. So this is optional. We don't have to do this. This is just for us to understand a bit how GraphQL works. So what you can see here, if I just click Prettify, this is one of our GraphQL requests, basically. So we have this events here. And what we query for is, as in this query is called an events query, and it queries all of the events that we have. So in this case, and then it has all of the properties inside that we get back. So maybe we don't need the created ad and we don't need the ID, but instead what I want to have is I want to have the event name, I want to have the event description, then the event date time, and then I would also like to have the image. So now I can add all of this inside here. I can run this. And then we see the results on the right side here. So we have the event, coding 101 with the description, the event date and time, and then we also have the image, for example, with the ID here. Alternatively, we could also, for example, type URL for the image here, and then instead we will get the URL that we can later on use in React to access this image. And we are done. That's how easy it is to actually set up everything that you need in Hygraph. Okay, so next we can jump right back into our code and do the implementation of Hygraph into our app so that the content can dynamically update from the database and from the content that we set up in Hygraph. So before we can get started doing that, let me just jump back to Hygraph here real quick. And what we have to do is that we first have to make all of our data available via a public API. So the way that this works is that we go down here to the project settings, and then we scroll down to this place here, public content API. And you will see here that you can basically set up your public content API, meaning that this information, whatever you make available here, will be available without having to authenticate first. So all you have to do is you go down here and you click yes, initialize defaults. Okay, perfect. And now those data points are available publicly. All we have to do is we can go up here, search the content API, and then we can copy this URL. So first what we will need to do is to install Apollo client to help us with our GraphQL queries. So the way that we will do this is we will go into here, and in the source folder, I will create a new folder called APIs, and inside, so this will be for everything related to handling the backend. And then inside here, I will create a new file called Apollo client.js. Then we go inside here, and then in my terminal, I can just first install this. So I will run npm install add apollo /client. Okay, just install this first. Okay, now that this is installed, what we can do is we will just import Apollo client and in memory cache from the library, and then we will set up our client. So we will say export constant client is a new Apollo client, and as an argument, this Apollo client gets an object. Okay, wait, sorry, let me set this up differently. I think this is better, like this. Okay, perfect, like this. Okay, and then this object takes 2 parameters, a URL and then a cache. So for the cache, all we do is we just set up a new in-memory cache. And for the URL, we just take the one that we have just copied from our public content API. And then we are already set up with our Apollo client, and we can move on to actually fetching the data. So what we will do here is that we will go into this index.js file, the index.js file, of course. We'll go down here, and all the way at the end, we will set up a new function. We will call this, so export async. So I mean, we are fetching data from a server, so obviously it has to be an async function, right? And let's call this fetch events. And inside here, we will define a new constant called data. And this will be an async function as well. So, and here we execute a query on the client that we have just created. So this query takes one argument, which is an object, and inside here we have the query. And what we will do is we will call GQL, which is our GraphQL library. So we just, okay, I've entered this here, so it will automatically import this here for me. And then I can go down and I can add in the query to get all of the events from our database. So in order to get this query, remember earlier when we were in Hygraph, let's just go back here, and then we can go into this API playground. And you can see that it is actually already set up here the way that this would look like. So what we can do is we will just copy this whole thing, then paste it in here. Then we'll just remove this events. Okay, perfect. And then we have set up our query now. Now that we have set up the query, we can go into the local events homepage, so the page where we will be actually using this data, and we can do a bit of setup here. So we will want to call all of the data from the server every time this component mounts. So we will want to make use of the React use effect hook. So let's just invoke this here. Okay, it will automatically import for us. I'll just set up a basic arrow function in here, and then we will populate it later before that needs to do. And then also we want to have some state management. So we want those events to be stored in the component state. So let me just set this up here as well. So let's call this constant events, and maybe, or let's call this events state, and then set events state. And then this is equal to use state, and we will set this up as an empty array first. Okay, I think this was not automatically imported, no problem. Let's import this here as well. Okay, and now what we can do is we can actually implement the functionality to call the fetch events function that we have just set up, and to update the state every time that this component loads. So let me just open this up here so that we can see the function that we have just set up. And the way that we will do this is that inside here in the use effect hook, we will set up a new async function. So it's called as async function get data maybe. And then inside here, we will set up a new constant called events data, which waits for the fetch events function to finish, right? So we execute this fetch events function that we have defined over here. So notice how it was also automatically imported for me. And then what we will do is once this data comes back, we set event state. So we update the component state to events data that we have. And then outside of this function, we just execute this get data function, get data. Oh, I think I wrote get data, okay, get data instead. Okay, perfect. Also, let me just make a small correction here because I just realized that the event state will not be set if we don't return any data here. So we have to return data.events, of course. So what we will do is we will go down here, and here where we have the static event boxes, instead what we will do is we will implement a mapping function. So we call it events. Okay, so event state dot map, and then inside here, what we'll do is just pass this an arrow function. So for every event, basically, do it like this. For every event, no, sorry, not like this. It should be like this. Okay, and then basically for every event that we receive that we have in our state, we just return an event box. But obviously, we don't use this predefined data, but instead what we do is that we say, okay, here for example, this should be event.image.url. This should be, okay, I'll get back to the month and the date in a bit. This is a bit more complicated. And then this too should be event name, event.name. And then event.description. And then obviously down here, we can just remove all of those containers here. And then now when we go into the browser, you can see that this perfectly loads all of the events that we have just set up with the names, with the descriptions and everything that we have from our previous, that we have set up in our Hygraph basically, right? So let's get back to the dates here. So what we will need to do is we will need to work with this a bit, because what you can see here is that the month is basically written like this, right? So the way that we will do this is that we will set up an array here. So let's just do this. Constant month names is equal to, and then we write all of the month names in 3-letter descriptions, right? So we just do it like this. Okay, and now what we can do is that we will first need to fetch the event right? So we call event dot date time. And then what we will need to do is that we will need to convert this, because it will just be sent as a string, basically, right, from our database. So instead, what we will do is we will create a new date object in JavaScript, right? Then we set it up with the string that we get from here. Then we say get month from this function. And then obviously we copy all of this and we put it into the month name. So we say month names, and then the index of the month names should be whatever we have fetched just now. And then for this down here, we can do a very similar thing. We can just copy all of the inside part of this. So again, we create a new date with the event date time. Then we say get date. And then we have set this up. And now, then when we go back into the website, we see that actually the dates load correctly. So there you have it. Within less than an hour, we have used Locofy.ai to convert a Figma design into a pixel-perfect working front-end code of high quality, and then have set up our Hygraph headless CMS in the background and connected those two together to build a fully functional events app. Hope you've enjoyed this.